much for that. Now, without further ado, I think I'll hand off to Nicky and Jun Liu.
Right, okay, so I'm now going to share my screen from current slide. Okay, can everyone see the Sojourn Tea Shop? Okay, yes. Yeah, great, okay. So, Jun and I have great pleasure today in taking you on a whistle-stop tour of the Sojourn Tea Shop. I've got the slide share going, so Jun, if I fail to go on to the next slide, just say, hey, next slide, please. It's due out next year with Sinoist Books, also known as ACA Books, by Pingwa, whose picture you can see right in the middle of the screen. And the Chinese title of the book, Zan Zuo, we're calling it the Sojourn Tea Shop. Okay, and over to Jun.
Hi, everyone. It's a great pleasure to see you here. So can you hear me clearly now?
Yeah, lovely.
Okay, great. So first, I would like to say a few words about the author here. Pingwa is one of the most prolific and widely translated Chinese authors of our time. And he comes from a humble origin. He was a country boy in northwest China's Shanxi province. So just picture a boy of barely 10 and carrying a load of firewood higher than his head and is trudging along rugged mountain paths for several kilometers every day for his home. And that's the kind of perseverance that you will see with his writing years on. And he made an early debut in the 1980s. By 1988, he already caught international attention when Professor Howard Goldblatt translated his novel Fu Zao into Turbulence, and it won the Pegasus Prize for Literature in the US. However, in 1993, he suffered a severe setback when his novel, The Ruined Capital, was banned 3 months after its publication. And the ban would last for 16 years. And also around the time he fell seriously ill and he was going through a long divorce. So going to the rock bottom would give him the strength and the deep understanding of the social bottom that would go on to inspire his great works. So all of his works, he first focused on his rural hometown, Shangzhou, which is in southern Shanxi province. And in recent years, he has been moving back to Xi'an, or he's often talking about it as Xijing, the western capital in his novel. And he always stays very close to the present. So it's the kind of now and here of his works that has caught wide recognition abroad. And many works have been translated into English, French, German, and many other languages. So that's this one is about.
Okay. Right. So we're here today to talk about co-translating, which it hasn't had a very good press recently, but actually it has a very long and honorable tradition. The Buddhist sutras were translated by teams of translators from Sanskrit and other languages into Chinese very early on. And as a lot of you will know, the monk from Monkey in Journey to the West was actually Xuanzang, a real historical character, and one of the most famous translators. Brought the sutras back to China, where they were all translated together in committee. And of course, the Bible, the King James's version, was famously translated in committee. Then there's another famous stroke infamous example, Ezra Pound, who translated this series of classical Chinese poems called Cathay, infamous because Ezra Pound didn't know a word of Chinese, and he was using his co-translator's heavily annotated literal translation. Ernest Fenelotha, it turned out, had actually died by the time Ezra Pound took his literal version. And of course, it was Ezra Pound who then became famous rather than Fenelotha. Bringing us bang up to date, there's a very famous contemporary co-translating couple, Howard Goldblatt, we've already mentioned, and his wife, Sylvia Liu Lin, who translate lots of novels together. So what about Jun and me? And indeed, why did we choose to work together? Well, when I first received this novel, which by the way is very unusual for Pingwa because it's entirely urban set, and unlike Happy, where Jun helped me before with the dialect, there's actually very little dialect. It's entirely a group of modern, urban women, business women in the city. Very little of the countryside enters it. It's all in the city. Well, firstly, and I was increasingly aware of this as we worked through it, I get a huge amount from Jun's insights on the cultural background. It's been an interesting, fruitful, and sometimes slightly head-banging process to go through all the cultural references that I may have actually skipped over or not even been aware of, or decided that, yes, I was aware of it, but I couldn't really get it into the translation. And Jun, on many occasions, has hauled me back again and said, no, try a bit harder. We've really got to see if we can get that cultural reference in, not necessarily into the words themselves, but into the paragraph, into the feeling of the text. And we'll talk a bit more about that as we go through. So it also, of course, goes much more swiftly if there are two of you doing it together. So how did we do it? We were very organized, as you can see. We've got a Google spreadsheet, and we basically divided it into 3 different rounds, with each of us doing the round. So Jun doing the first draft, me checking, revising the first draft, then the second draft where we've got the complete file, which is where we are at the moment. We each of us go through all of it, and we're beginning to see that each character of these this dozen or so women has a personality, and we check back with ourselves, are we reflecting the personality differences in the language, and so on. And we're on to the hooray, the third round, where we're going to read it through only on the English. We'll be doing that over the next couple of weeks. And then we're looking at it as a literary work in English. So over to Jun to tell you a bit more about it.
So this story, it begins with a Russian girl who is called Eva. She comes back to Xijing, where she once studied, and she rejoins her close friend Hairuo, who is running this tea shop, and it's called the Sojourn Tea Shop. So here she gets to know Hairuo's sisterhood. There are 10 very successful business women, and Eva also develops a relationship with the city's most famous writer, Iguan. In the matter of 3 weeks or so, 2 women of the sisterhood pass away, and Hairuo is taken away for corruption investigations about the city's top official. And in the end, the tea shop is destroyed in an explosion, and Eva lives in a worsening smog. So we have decided on the book's title as the Sojourn Tea Shop, because basically in Chinese, 暂坐 means to sit a while. And it captures the essence of this book. It's about how everyone is basically a passenger in this world from birth to death. So what's so interesting about this book? For anyone interested to learn about a different culture, then you can catch glimpses of the Chinese culture, like tea, like calligraphy and Buddhism. And for businessmen, if you want to do business in China, there are lots of etiquettes and tips about doing business there. like what kind of gifts to prepare and how to give them. And for readers, you can get to see rare glimpses of what a leading Chinese writer's studio really looks like. Because one of the central characters here, Iguan, is largely based on the author himself. And Nicky and I have both been to his studio. It's a real museum there. So the next one. Next slide.
Yes, sorry, whoops. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah. So this book is like a mini encyclopedia of Chinese culture. And at any moment, we could be doing research on a number of things. And it's so fascinating. For example, we would be researching the structural difference between an autumn fan used by men and a plain scholar fan used by women. And then we would be looking up the internet for the straddle ridge roof. What does that look like in ancient Chinese architecture? And at the bottom left, you can see the apsaras. They are the Buddhist fairies. They bring peace and happiness. So many of these women in the sisterhood, they are compared to these apsaras. So how do they look like? And especially towards the end of the book, there is one particular character who's being compared to one of these fairies. And it's crucial to get the image right. And then Xi'an has a very long history. About some 3,000 years ago, it was already the capital of the Western Zhou dynasty. So with such a long history, there are huge, deep cultural traditions. And the Xijing Guyue mentioned in this book, although it's only a short passage, we had to do a lot of research, like the double cloud gong here. It's certainly different from most of the musical instruments we would expect. And at the bottom right, it looks like a high-tech coffin, but it is an energy tank. So what you do is to lie down there and the lid closes on you and the machine heats up. In a matter of half an hour or so, you can sweat profusely. And that's supposed to do you a lot of good for your health. Nicky.
Right, yeah, before I go on to the next slide, I think one of the most interesting things about this novel, apart from the personalities of the 12 women and the way they interact with each other and with their struggles with officialdom, is the interaction, the interweaving of ancient and modern. So the fans, ancient, the apsaras, excuse my pronunciation, the Buddhist figures, very ancient, and the ancient roofs. And then you've got this energy tank, which one of the women is running as a business and trying to entice the local business people into it so she can grow her business. So it's a fascinating interweaving of ancient and modern, as well as the interactions between the dozen or so characters. Right, so here we are. We have the perfect translation. I'm going to deal basically just with the top two. Of course, the irony here is that there's, as any translator will know in any language, there's no such thing as the perfect translation. Anyone who knows Chinese will instantly recognize the first three characters, kan zhe now, where a group of people are gawking or rubbernecking or standing around, just generally staring at whatever hubbub is going on. So we've got, in the top right-hand corner, we've got a lot of people who are kan re now. They're all having a look at this poor guy who appears to be dressed up in something weird and has fallen over. So it's a very common word that or phrase that you're going to come across during your translations from any Chinese novels. There'll be lots of people kan re now watching, just standing around watching. I've never actually used rubbernecking quite so often as I did in this novel. And what the editor will think about it, we'll soon find out. But as I said, there is no such thing as the perfect translation. Some editors, or we ourselves, might think in the end, well, maybe we don't like rubbernecking because it's a bit too American, although I have nothing against having a slightly American sounding phrase. Or maybe actually here it perfectly suits the circumstances. Or maybe we should just use the word gawking. We are, after all, allowed to be very British in this novel. In other novels I've translated, like Pingwa's Happy Dreams, I had to be entirely American, which was very difficult for me. So the kind of feeling you get from these perfect translations may appear to you perfect the evening before, and the next morning you might wake up as the translator and think, oh no, this is definitely an imperfect translation. Going on to the next, cracking melon seeds. This is a slightly different problem. The beginning of the novel, Jun has mentioned the smog. The smog is a kind of overwhelming presence throughout the novel. The novel takes place in Xijing, the Western capital, which is actually a fictionalized version of Xi'an, the real Western city in China. And along with the smog, we've got this rather hallucinatory image of all these people out in the street, teeming through the streets, all talking. You can't see them clearly because the smog is so bad. So we've got a kind of hubbub, a kind of tumult, a noise of all these people talking, but it merges into something where, and I'll just read you our eventual translation, a kind of uproar. When speech becomes so clamorous, that's the speech of all the people walking along the streets, shouting at each other in the smog, it loses all sense and rhythm and begins to sound like nothing so much as a million people cracking sunflower seeds between their teeth. I had a problem with this paragraph because it's clearly important. It is virtually the first paragraph in the novel. It sets the scene. What it actually said was, it feels like a myriad mouths simultaneously cracking melon seeds, or swarms of mosquitoes and flies gathering in a deafening humming and buzzing. My problem was that I think that Chinese often counterposes two quite striking images in one sentence. And I very often feel that it would have much more impact in English if you chose the stronger image and dropped the other one. So of course I chose the nice easy one, which was the humming of insects. And I dropped the sunflower seeds. And Jun said, yes, but what about the idea that people cracking melon seeds or sunflower seeds in a large group of people has that kind of crackly but chaotic sound? So I went on YouTube and I managed to find this lovely girl at the bottom right-hand side, just a very short clip of her cracking sunflower seeds, no speech, nothing. And then I imagined that as a million people all doing the same thing. So I dropped the buzzing of insects and we had the cracking of melon or sunflower seeds back in, which again, just goes to show that there is no such thing as the perfect translation. Right, now we'll go on to the next and over to Jun.
Yeah. So I want to share with you something very important that I learned from working with Nicky. As a translator, I often try to stay as faithfully to the original text as possible to capture all the content and intent of the author. But in literary translation, I learned that sometimes you have to consider the readers, how they are going to receive the translation. Are they going to understand what we are trying to present? A very typical example here is the Tibetan Buddhism Buddhist term 活佛, or the living Buddha. As I did some books about Tibetan folk customs, Tibetan history, and Tibetan tourism, so I know that this term, the correct translation is tulku. It means reincarnated sages, like the Dalai Lama, like the Panchen Lama. These are all tulku. And there are actually many researchers who are saying that living Buddha, or 活佛, the Chinese term, is incorrect. We should not be using that term. So when I came across this term at first in this novel, I said to Nicky that we shouldn't be using this wrong term. We should be using tulku. That's the correct way to translate it. But then she asked me, so Hairuo, the devout Buddhist, the tea shop owner, she might be using tulku because she might know. But then what about the other person, the other, her friends and her shop assistants? Are they going to use this term as well? It's a highly specific term. And more importantly, will our readers understand? How many of our readers will have learned this kind of word? So I considered that for a long while, and I came around and decided that it's better we just use living Buddha. But because Iguan, the city's top writer, he is very knowledgeable, and there is actually a scene where Iguan is discussing what is a living Buddha. So there we got a chance to use this correct term, tulku. And another example is the wood you see here. So in Iguan's studio, there are lots of interesting, fascinating items. And there is a tree trunk from floor to ceiling. And it's made of a very rare kind of hardwood, the Hainan Huanghuali. So if you've managed to find a top quality Huanghuali bracelet, it could cost some 30,000 yuan in the market, which is about 3,000 pounds. And for a tree trunk of that size, that could mean millions of yuan. But this one, this tree trunk is it means much more than just wealth. It's called Tong Tian Zhu, or the column reaching the sky. So it symbolizes the author or the writer's ambition to reach higher power, to gain more prestige. So we thought about this, and we added a bit of information in the text to show that it's a symbol of rising power and success. Next one.
Okay, yeah. Right, okay. Another very quick example of something that a translation partner can pick up. They're chatting about the weather, which is pretty awful. And Wen Lai, who is the only male shop assistant, all the others are young women. He doesn't just portentously say the weather is God's will or heaven's will. He actually says quite a bit more, but just for the moment, I'll focus your attention on, I gaily translated it as the weather is God's will. And Jun pointed out that there are Christians in China who might say God's will, but Wen Lai is not one of them. So I quickly changed that to heaven's will and blah, 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 the rest of his conversation. So simple points that a co-translator can pick you up on. And the next.
Yeah, so the Chinese language is notorious for being very vague and ambiguous. You will often find sentences without a subject, without any object, and still the sentence would make perfect sense among Chinese. But when we translate that into English, we often have to identify the subject and the object. So when I did the draft translation from Chinese into English, sometimes I get stuck with the original structure. And so Nicky is often the one to remind me to step back and to take a look at the whole picture. So there is a scene when they're talking about how the customers have been approaching the tea shop, approaching Hairuo for help. And when they get to know each other, they ignored her. The problem with when they get to know each other in Chinese is that it could be they got to know each other, the clients themselves, but it could also mean that they got to know Hairuo better. So, but later on, we thought about this, and the entire context means that these people, they come to the tea shop to build up connections so they can grow their business. So we think that it makes better sense to say that these people get to know each other well, and then they ignore Hairuo. That's just one of the examples.
Okay, right. As I did say that there's very little dialect because this is entirely set in an urban setting. But one of the funny things that I stumbled and Jun picked me up on was the Xiangdang. I just, Xiang Township Dang Party. Oh, it must be a local party member. It isn't. It is one of the few bits of dialect in the book. My friend from my neck of the woods, from my hometown, whatever. There's also, you come across in the book a very, occasionally a very nice country sort of rural sort of metaphor. And in this case, the bottom one, this rake has teeth, but our cash box has no bottom, is one where the manager of the shop, Tang, is telling Hairuo, the owner, that she spends too much money, basically. If she keeps giving presents to all the local business people, she won't have any money left. And she's comparing herself, the manager, to a rake with teeth, and the owner to the cash box. In other words, you reckon, you feel that our cash box has no bottom, but I've got teeth and I'm going to stop you spending all this money on people. So there were a few really nice, colourful expressions that we really worked on. And very swiftly, this one was ever so funny. If you look at the drawing at the bottom, the cartoon at the bottom right-hand side, we've got an illustration of the 4-character phrase, which you will see in Chinese, the first 4 characters underlined, which describes how a middle-ranking leader, and we all know in the West as well, middle-ranking leaders are likely to be the most under stress. Because why? They have to look up to their leaders and they have to look down on and manage their juniors. And in Chinese, it's extremely succinct. And we had number 2, eyes up and eyes down. It's all very well as a strategy, but without the courage of your convictions, you'll never have a smooth ride. Someone is saying that this is the way you should do business. You've got to be in control of who you look up to and who you look down on. And we looked at both options 1 and 2 and thought, oh my goodness, this is terribly clunky. We either miss it out or we try and reproduce the catchiness of the phrase. And we ended up with, we looked at brown nosing or nose in the air, and we settled on he, that's the guy who's just been arrested. He was a real brown nose, look down your nose. And actually, it was quite convenient that one of the characters then says, what on earth do you mean by brown nose, look down your nose? Because then it allows us to explain it without having to introduce a whole load of dialogue, which is going to sound very clunky. So there is the character in the right-hand corner doing the brown nose. And then when the big boss is not there, will look down his nose on his juniors. And in fact, as it explained, he bullies them. So, right, on to the next. And I believe it might be, yes, Jun, are you going to start on this?
Okay. So this book has more than 20 characters who talk, and we need to figure out their relations, their background, and even their psychology to give them convincing voices and tone to bring them alive in English. And at the center of the story is Iguan, a writer and calligrapher who is clearly inspired by the author himself. And this is such a complicated character. It's like piecing together a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle as we plodded along this project. And at first, you see this writer chatting with various women, and it's clear that he's much closer to them than just casual friends. And then we follow a sort of art broker to his studio and see this writer selling his calligraphy at 100,000 yuan. That's more than 11,000 pounds a piece. And he demands not a cent less. And the next time we enter his studio, Iguan makes a pass on Eva, the Russian girl, who is half his age. And I remember I couldn't stand it anymore. So I sent Nicky an email about this character. And eventually we decided not to jump at any conclusions before finishing this first draft translation. So when we are going through the translation for the second round, we realized that we've actually added something to this part when Iguan was making a pass to Eva. And Nicky can tell you about that.
Oh dear, I failed to get the bit of text up in front of me. So Iguan is an infuriating character. He loves beautiful women. It's not entirely clear that he's had affairs with all the women in the sisterhood, the group of women friends, but it's hinted at. I mean, some of the time I was pulling my hair out and saying, I can't. I mean, this guy is frankly the most old-fashioned sort of male chauvinist. And he even says to Eva when he's trying to seduce her, having got her thoroughly drunk, that, oh, you're a beautiful flower. And I thought what he was saying was, I'm just going to pick you, as in you pluck a flower. And in fact, afterwards, quite recently, even though I still think he is not a very acceptable character in many ways, because because frankly, he's a male chauvinist, but he's more than that. And what he actually, when I look back, he never said he was going to pluck the flower that was Eva. He admired her. Okay, he didn't admire her from a distance. He was also trying to have sex with her. But he was a more complicated character than we thought. And I would hesitate to say that Jia Pingwa is seeing himself as Iguan. There may well be some similarities, especially in the description of the studio. But there's also, it's also very like the chief protagonist in the Red Chamber Dream or Dream of Red Mansions. So Iguan is actually very like that young man who has close but rather ambiguous relationships with a group of women. So the jury is still out on how annoying he is. But I suppose one of the nice things will be to see the reviews when this book is published. How many people find Iguan totally infuriating? And I do hope that they won't go away with the idea that this is an entirely a self-portrait of Jia Pingwa, because I don't think it is. I think that it's far more complex than that. Okay. Yes, on to Jun.
Yeah, so more words about this character. Just a few chapters on, Eva goes to Iguan's studio once again, and he throws her a surprise birthday party and they start drinking. We are still wondering if he did put something in the wine or not. And so they start talking about a Russian poet who had many lovers. And we decided it must be Pushkin, but maybe it's better to let the readers to figure that out. And so the two were having a good time together. But then Iguan gets a call from his boss. He is asked to give a public speech to denounce the former city's top official caught on corruption charges. And so he says something like a puzzle there. He says, I am raising the bird the way I like it, instead of the way the bird likes it. So in translation, this is pretty straightforward. It comes from Zhuangzi, the Taoist philosopher. There's actually a small story about this. The king of Lu, he had a rare visitor, a large seabird, and he liked it so much. He asked all his musicians to gather and play to the bird. And he also offered various favorite food of his to this bird. But for 3 days, the bird ate nothing. And in the end, it died. So it's easy to translate this one sentence, but we had a lot of time to think about what did Iguan mean with this? Was he talking about himself as the bird and the king of Lu as the officials? So, because clearly the officials were like parading the writer and his works as the pride of the city. Or is he talking about his ideals in writing? So luckily, we still have the author around to answer our questions. In fact, we asked him so many questions. He probably got tired of us. And he replied to us that with this line, Iguan is saying that his writing and calligraphy cannot reach a very high level because he is struggling to meet the demands of the officials. So he is not actually following the rules and principles of art and literature. And he is trying to avoid ending up in a trap. So we still have doubts about the real connections of this character and the author, of course, but it does shed light onto the deep thinking about this character. So this is a very three-dimensional, multifaceted character that we find very fascinating. And after this discussion, I think that my impression of this character has changed a lot.
Yeah, I think also it shows how much politics, corruption and city management permeates the novel, because the women, who after all are the chief focus of the novel, are constantly struggling with city bureaucracy, the need to make friends in the right places and so on. So although it's not spelled out, there is these women, and Iguan, the chief male character, can't exist without coming to terms with the way the city and politics happen. Okay, so I'm going to skip that one, say very briefly about the cobweb of relationships. This is down again to the nitty-gritty of translation. All of these women and the man address each other by various words like 姐, older sister, older brother, 老师, meaning teacher, a term of respect, 先生, and so on and so forth. And then the shop workers are called little or young, although they may be neither little nor young. So this was a real nitty-gritty translation problem. And we are at the moment, we've basically chosen, we've been already talking to the Sinoist editor, and we've decided to go with a few choice pinyin phrases, which is basically older sister for a senior woman, and 老师 for the respected, the teacher, the respected male character, and then try not to bombard the readers with too many olds, littles, youngs, 老板, and so on. Okay, if we go on to, yes, let's go on to food. And again, it's to do with how much do you use the transcription system, the pinyin, when you do food, or do you try, so you can see the pinyin here, bang, bang, roll, B-A-N-G, B-A-N-G-R-O-U. So that is the transcription of a particular kind of meat stew, which is famous in Xi'an, which itself is famous for its street foods. So we've chosen on the theory that readers, especially when it's to do with food, they are willing to go for it. Everybody loves food. It's relatively easy for people to click on Google Images and find out what the food looks like. However, we also have at the bottom here, we have left, which I think is probably, this is conchiglie, but that's Italian. But we also have a Xi'an street food, which is called cat's ears, because it's very similar. You take a little tiny bit of dough, you press your thumb into it until it makes a kind of little ear. And this exists in Turkic cooking as tokmak, again, excuse my pronunciation. And we did wonder whether we should use the tokmak on the, perhaps because the reader might be more familiar with tokmak than with Martian or cat's ears or perish the thought conchiglie. In the end, we've gone with cat's ears because it's described quite carefully how the food is made. And it's quite a nice little description. But you're always juggling, what can the reader take? What can the reader understand? What is going to be the most vivid image for the reader? We reckon that readers are likely to be very kindly disposed to us if we talk about food. So we'll try and make the food as vivid as possible. But cat's ears is quite a nice way of describing. It also happens to be how it's described in the Chinese. And food as metaphor we're going to skip, and I'm going to give the last word to Jun, who knows all about this kind of mutton pummel soup.
Yeah, the mutton pummel soup is an iconic snack in Xi'an. If you ever go there, you must try this. So while the chefs are preparing the mutton soup in the kitchen, it's the customers who are preparing the flatbread. So you need to break it in half and then into quarters, and then break it further down until you pinch it into tiny bits about the size of a bee's head. And make sure that every little piece has a crispy surface on it. So this is sent to the kitchen, and the chefs boil it up with the soup just to the right degree, and then it's served to the table. And remember not to mix it up, because you'll spoil all the effort. And just scoop a little bit of soup with a little bit of the ingredient there, and enjoy every last bite. I'm saying this because the author has been writing this. He said he did the rewriting for the manuscript 4 times. And then we also have been working on this for more than half a year now. So we hope that when the readers do see this book, you'll also enjoy it with as much passion and patience as we did. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, it's not just a description of the soup for its own sake. There is actually a dramatic scene where one of the women is refusing to eat her or prepare her pummel soup because she's owed a lot of money and doesn't know how she's going to get it back. Right, I'm going to stop sharing and we can go to discussion and questions.
As someone who's both had pummel soup before and have not had breakfast this morning yet, I'm very jealous. So yeah, Francis of Leeds Center has very kindly agreed to moderate the Q&A sections. Francis, can you hear us?
I can, yes.
Fantastic. So I think we have a couple of questions in the chat already. Yep. And if you have, should you have any questions for both of our translators, please do pop them into the chat and we'll get to them. So over to you, Francis.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you both for such a great talk, which combined these sorts of general ideas that we can all relate to, and some really useful specific comments on the text that you've been working on too. The first question I'm going to start off with is from Michelle in the chat, and it's the question about if you encounter misogynistic text in your translations, what do you do? Can you negotiate with the author? Do you ever consider cutting it? Is that possible even with so-called great literature? And I know that misogyny is something which quite often translators are concerned about in translating from Chinese into English. So if we could start off with your thoughts on that, that would be great.
Right, yes, I'll jump in here because yes, to all of those strategies. I must admit, I didn't ask Jia Pingwa, but I was absolutely infuriated by Iguan at the start. I mean, he's, I wouldn't say he's misogynist, although I've come across misogynist characters in other Jia Pingwa novels, but he is infuriatingly old-fashioned. I mean, he actually says to Eva something like, she says to him, please teach me how you do X. I think it's calligraphy or something like that, because I'd like to learn. And he says, oh, but your looks are your talent. You don't need to learn anything. Just rely on your looks. And I'm going, no, I can't do this. So I think we kept it as it was. We grimaced and gritted our teeth. I also realized that that particular paragraph had made me misinterpret the seduction scene, where I had him as wanting to pick the flower that was Eva. And actually that wasn't in the original. So yes, there's a certain amount of teeth gritting. He is more complex than that, but totally infuriating. But when it was, if you look at Daniel's picture, Sinoist Books, behind him, you'll see broken wings. There was the most horrific rape scene in that. And I really, really hated translating that. I think I looked very carefully at the Chinese and toned it down ever so slightly. I think he had something like rivers of blood. And I thought, well, actually, that's not even very realistic. If this woman who survives the rape is described as rivers of blood flowing across the floor, it's just not going to happen. You know, she would have died. She would have hemorrhaged to death. So I had the blood, but I took away the rivers. So it's a constant, it does also show, going back to the Sojourn Tea Shop, quite how much of this male chauvinist culture still exists. And indeed, and Chinese women will tell you this as well, including Chinese authors and poets, women poets, that there's been a resurgence in this old-fashioned attitude to women, because it's come back again. Mao squashed it to an extent, but it's come back again since. And over to Jun to say what she feels about it.
I think Nicky has captured it so well. Well, my attitude is more about respecting what the author wants to say. And Nicky has also said that a lot of the times I'm pulling her back closer to the original. And yeah, but we did have a lot of discussion about these plots. And like today I was going through some later chapters, and it's just, there is one of the sisterhood, Xia Zihua, she died of leukemia. And then she left her young son with her very old mother. And then Hairuo takes it upon herself to arrange the boy's future. And it turns out that Xia Zihua actually had an affair with a married man. So Hairuo gets to meet this man. And the man comes up saying lots of flowery things, like he would, from now on, he would be taking up a father's responsibilities, and he would be taking care of the old lady like a real obedient son-in-law would do. But then what does he have in mind for this young child? He proposes that he will send this boy of just 3 to his friends in a different city in southern China. And to me, it sounds just like he's shirking his responsibilities again. But from the text, you can see that the author totally agrees with this man, and Hairo also agrees with this person. And no one seems to be thinking about asking the boy what he would want. Obviously, his granny is the closest family he has now. He has lost his mother. He never, ever sees his father. And so who's really thinking about this boy's future? And I have such doubts, but we can discuss. But in the end, we need to respect what the author has to say there, and we'll let the readers to decide.
Okay, thank you very much. One question now, since the focus of this session is on collaborative translation, the relationship between the two of you is obviously a very positive relationship and kind of has to be. You mentioned when we were talking at the beginning, Nicky, about traditions of collaborative translation in China, and you mentioned Howard Goldblatt and his wife Sylvia Lee. And there's also, of course, the other famous married couple, Yang Xianyi and Gladys Yang. That relationship between two translators who are working together clearly is going to be a very intense relationship. And I suppose my slightly cheeky question is, do you think it would be actually easier or more difficult to do that if you were a married couple?
More difficult, like trying to teach your son or daughter to drive.
Okay.
I don't know what Jun thinks about that.
Well, I think, I don't know about other cultures, but I think that in the Chinese culture, we have this tendency to avoid confrontation, open confrontation. And we also need to be very considerate of the other party. So I regard this project as a rare learning experience from a world's top-rate translator in this field. And I like it very much. And I have learned so much from Nicky. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I just add to that it's been a huge privilege for me, and it's not the first time I've co-translated. I have co-translated with one Canadian and one British translator, which is a very slightly different kind of thing. But I mean, the common element is that basically, especially nowadays, you're working entirely online. Doesn't matter where your co-translator is. And as we all know, internet communications etiquette is everything. You really have to be careful what you say, because you may have a spasm of irritation now, but if you put that down in your email, like, no, we've already gone over this, and no, I thought we'd agreed something different, that stays there forever. And you really have to respect your collaborator. And so it kind of makes you pause. And I think that's a very good thing. I wish I could transfer this to my everyday life. Pause before you speak.
And I'd like to add something, because doing translation is often a very solitary practice. You have to make all these difficult decisions all by yourself. And with today's machine translation catching up speed, oftentimes you're just left with a fraction of a second to decide which word to use. But literary translation is like a luxury to me. And I especially enjoy the communication, the back and forth with someone who is also working on the same thing. And I'm often surprised by the kind of deep understanding of Chinese with my collaborators. I've worked with 5 or more native English speakers. And oftentimes they caught my mistakes. I just neglected some important elements in the original text. And so it teaches me to be humble.
Thank you very much. Next question is back to Pingwa specifically, and is from Pingwa. The discourse style of Pingwa is notoriously hard to convey. Did you try to do that at all in the translation, or were you mainly focusing on the story? And if you did try, how did you go about it?
Jun, I'd rather you started.
Well, actually, we still need to work on the book's epilogue, because the author makes a point about he's giving so many characters, so much conversation, and he intentionally does that to represent what people actually do in daily life. And so in our draft translation, we managed to try to capture what's being said. But in the second round, we are trying to further shape up the characters. And so the main characters, like Iguan, for example, he's always knowledgeable. He quotes classics all the time. And Hairuo, she would often quote some rural idioms, and she's being funny. And then there are 2 or 3 other women in the sisterhood who are always joking, but they joke on different things. So there is one character, Xinqi. Nicky likes her very much. She comes in and she's like a mistress. She is having an affair with the Hong Kong tycoon, and she's having all those devious plans. But then eventually she's rehabilitated by Hairuo and changes to a new person. So we have to think of ways to reflect these subtle changes in the way they speak. And I guess 80% of this novel is dialogue, so it's quite daunting.
Yeah, I would say as a general point, in any literary translation, you're looking at the literary style of the author and trying to recreate it in English. And it's a constant balancing act. One of the challenges with this book, as Jun has said, is that it's entirely dialogue. Dialogue has to sound like someone is actually speaking it. And so you've got to get the style, but you've also got to get a realistic dialogue. And there's very little description. The bit that I read you about the noise in the street and the smog being like a million people crunching melon seeds is a rare exception to that. In this novel, it's largely dialogue. So we're constantly working on matters of style and how Pingwa writes and expresses himself. But, you know, there are many different pulls. We have loyalty to the author, and we also have loyalty to the end product.
Thank you. I'm going to a more general question again now, and I'm going to combine 2 questions from the chat, if I may. First of all, Isha has asked, a very general question, how are China-related literature books doing in recent years? And linked in with that, Lisa Marx's question about what do you think is the greatest challenge in Chinese to English books in translation being accepted in the market, say, compared to other Asian languages in translation?
Shall I have a go at that one? How are books doing in the market? Well, it can be rather depressing, because at the end of every year for Paper Republic, I draw up a list of fiction and poetry translated into English during that year. And I also put in quite numerous, really grown a lot in the last few years. But how many of those books have won international literary prizes? Let alone, I never dare to ask how many have become bestsellers. Very few. And the major literary prizes last year had virtually no Chinese novels, even longlisted, let alone shortlisted. The year before, there were 3 or 4. shortlisted. So why? What is the problem? I actually think that two particular genres have done rather well in translation. One is sci-fi. The other is children and young adults literature. But what are the problems? I'm not sure it's really problems. It's a number of different issues. One is that the way fiction, the kind of fiction that you get in China is rather different. The genre may be different. There's no easy fix. There's no popular crime fiction, for example. Loads of publishers in the West would love the new Nordic noir transported to China. It's never going to happen. It just isn't being written. Therefore, it can't be translated. There are writers who write about crime, like IE, but they're not specifically crime novels, and they're not necessarily an easy read. Then a lot of the novels are very long. And so Western publishers flinch because they've got to pay for the translation. The subsidy system doesn't work terribly smoothly at the moment. If you have Japanese, Korean, German, French, Spanish, there are quite a few translation subsidies based within the host country, as it were. It does exist in China, but it doesn't work. It isn't very easy to get those translation grants for Western publishers. So there are a number of different problems, and we literary translators just have to keep plugging away at it. And the way we do that, well, I'm involved with Paper Republic along with another handful of other people. But also individual translators will choose their favorite novels and will try to pitch them to publishers, which is also an important way of getting best books out there. It's a long process.
I think it might have something to do with the reading habit also. I know some Chinese publishers who are promoting their works every year at the Frankfurt Book Fair, for example, and they've been having tremendous success with the Spanish and the Arabic markets, but not so with English. It just doesn't seem to be a tradition among English speakers to read translations, especially from cultures so different from theirs.
Thank you very much. And Michelle Dieter has just reminded us in the chat, on tangent with the crime writers issue, that there's also the Hong Kong writer Chan Ho-kei, who perhaps because he's been influenced so much by Western crime as well, he may be somebody to check out if you're interested in crime writing. And she's mentioned Second Sister, and of course there's also The Borrowed. Okay, we've had a couple of questions from people who, and sorry, yes, before I go on, Daniel, could you just give me a shout as to how long, when you would like us to finish?
I think we have another 10 minutes.
Okay.
Caitlin, does that sound good to you?
Yeah, that sounds absolutely great.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much. We've had a couple of questions in the chat from about career-wise becoming a literary translator. And firstly, what advice would you give somebody wanting to move from general Chinese into English translation to literary translation? And then the second question, which is related to that, is what's the one piece of advice you would give to somebody, a new translator, who was wanting to embark on Chinese into English literary translation?
Go on a summer school. They don't necessarily happen in the summer, but let's say a summer school will be a short 1-week course for several reasons. Well, nowadays it's even easier than it used to be because you don't have to go to the country. Many of these short courses will happen online. You get to know not only your workshop leader, who will give you many pearls of wisdom, but you'll also get to know other translators. And it's really, it's so encouraging to meet other translators from Chinese, from other languages. with whom you share your thoughts, get ideas. So I guess the second piece of advice is network, and carry on networking, and read Paper Republic. That's the third bit of advice.
I think that if you really want to get into the literary translation circle, first of all, you need to be prepared. It's not very well paid, and you probably won't be able to support yourself. And it would take at least half a year, sometimes.
Jun, I've lost you. Nicky, can you hear Jun?
No.
It's much longer than that to translate a year, or even longer than that to pub you until the end. Hello?
Hi,
yes?
Jun, we lost you just for a few seconds. If you could maybe repeat that second half of what you said, that would be great.
Okay, I was saying that before going in there, you need to make sure you're really passionate about literature. And because it's realistic, if you can't support yourself with this endeavor, which will consume almost all your energy and all your time, then maybe do not consider it first. But if you are passionate, then get prepared. And also, like Nicky said, just reach out. I got to know Nicky by reaching out to her on Paper Republic. And so I helped her to look through some of the tricky terms in the Happy Dreams. And then she suddenly offered me this project out of the blue. So.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And in the chat there, Caitlin has included some links to the Bristol Translation School, which, of course, Nicky was tutor at this year, and also for translation residencies at the National Centre for Writing, and a Gŵyl event on translation as career, which has that already happened, Caitlin? Is that a recording?
Yes, that's a recording from this summer's festival, and I would highly recommend it. I learned so much from Rebecca, and it's really, really useful on sort of a breakdown of how she sort of started how to develop a specialism. So she had grown up, her mum is a seamstress, and she'd learned all these sewing words, and so to begin with she was doing loads of technical work like sewing machine manuals and stuff, and then when you have a bit of that work, then you can build up into I think there's not many translators, for sort of anyone who doesn't know, there's not many translators who get to just do literary fiction. Nicky Harman is perhaps only one of the few. So yes, so I would recommend checking that out.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Oh, we've just had one more question in, and I'm just reading as I'm speaking, so sorry if I mangle it, from Galdi. And it's a question to Jun. How does it feel to translate from your mother tongue, and what made you decide to do so, and how did you build your career?
Well, it's more like an accident. So I was actually working as a journalist at China Daily, and one of my former classmates, she got a project from the China Intercontinental Press. They needed someone to translate a large project on the Tibetan book series about Tibet. So they were running short of time, and they got me working on one of the books. And that was the beginning. And later on, I somehow convinced one of the editors there to translate a collection of Lao She's essays from the 1930s. And that showed me how real literary translation can be so different from general translation. And after that, I somehow caught the attention of an American translator, Bruce Humes. He just contacted me at China Daily. And I remember he famously said, when people come to look for a Chinese novel, they are expecting sex, politics, and war, or something like that. So But anyway, I started working with him. I helped him to polish his work on 迟子建额尔古纳河的右岸. It's translated as the last quarter of the moon. And then he realized that I had a keen interest in literature. So later on, he asked me to join him in co-translating a Uyghur author, Alat Asmus novel, which is the Confessions of a Jade Lord. So we each did half of the chapters, and then we swapped the draft translations, and we had great fun trying to turn Uyghur cultural terms into English, because the writer was writing in Chinese, and he's also fluent in Russian. So there are lots of terms in Uyghur, Turkish, Russian, and they're all mixed up in Chinese. And his usage of Chinese is very different from Han Chinese writers. So we had a great fun there. And so after that, did something else, translated some excerpts from Jia Pingwa's novels. And then I just happened to be free when Nicky asked my help with this book. Oh, about translating from my mother tongue. Like I said, it's very easy to get stuck with the original text, especially the structure and the content. But then when we will be working on the third round now, we will not be looking at the Chinese. And then you start to see that actually what I have been trying to clinging onto in the original text, it doesn't work in English. When you look at the translations completely from the English point of view, then you see that we have to move one step further to English. And that may be some logical changes. We might need to swap around some paragraphs, and we might need to further sharpen up some dialogues. And that would be possible only after we discard the Chinese. Hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much. I'm aware that this is a whole day event and it's online, and we're all becoming increasingly aware of the need for comfort breaks when we're going to long online events. So I think I'm going to have to bring the questions to a close there, but thank you so much, Jun and Nicky, for your really interesting insights. And I'm going to pass over now to either Daniel or Caitlin.